You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 235. Joining me on today's show is host of the Peace and Liberty podcast and recent graduate of the Mises University, which is definitely something he should be putting on his resume to get on these, libertarian shows. Welcome to the show, Steven Clyde.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Kyle. I've had you on my show several times, so I think this is the first time I've been on your show, so it's a pleasure.
You know, I got a topic that I don't think I focus on a ton on the show just because it can be divisive, and that is economics that I want to talk about today. But the economic is important when you're talking about defense spending in the U.S. empire because, you know, as we're going to get into on today's show, the Congress just passed a $700 and something billion bill to fund the Defense Department for just 1 year. And so that's obviously going to have massive implications on the entire world because, that's a bigger, amount of money than a lot of countries' GDP, but it's also going to have a lot of effects on the U.S. economy. And, I think that's something definitely worth discussing. So, Stephen, glad to have you here. And I guess, let's start this off by just giving a general overview of Austrian economics. Don't have to go through a whole human action, type explanation, but just, 5 minutes or whatever you need. To kind of explain the theory of Austrian economics.
All right, I'm kind of going to meet you in the middle there. It's not going to be too long, but I am going to give a very thorough overview. So let me start off like this. I'm going to recommend two pieces to get a good understanding of what Austrian economics is. The first, it's a piece called The Philosophical Origins of Austrian Economics by David Gordon. And the second is titled The Austrian School of Economics, the family album of the Ludwig von Mises Institute. So if you're new to this, these two pieces will reflect a lot of what I'm going to say. But the Austrian School of Economics arose in opposition to the German historical school in the 1880s. Many are familiar with G.W.F. Hegel, whose viewpoints played a crucial role in what would evolve. Hegel, believe it or not, he actually thought property was essential, but he was utterly convinced of what's known as the doctrine of internal relations. So the doctrine of internal relations basically says that everything that exists is bound by unity, meaning everything is related to everything else. So, for example, imagine if I decide to lift my arm or not lift my arm. Either decision would affect the whole world. It's a little bit confusing, but everything is related to everything else. So why does this matter? Well, it's important to remember that the German historical school, led by people such as Gustav Schmoller, Werner Sombart, Ottmar Spam, they in essence denied economic laws. For example, they didn't believe in things like supply and demand, or that, for example, other things equal, a rise in the minimum wage will lead to unemployment. They denied these kind of things. So the Austrians would argue you don't even have to test these things. We can deduce unfalsifiable ideas, and the main unfalsifiable idea is that humans act. You can't falsify that idea because in trying to do that, you contradict yourself because you're acting by attempting to say you don't act. So I'm just going to mention a few people here. Richard Cantillon, he wrote a book called Essay on the Nature of Commerce in 1730, and that was kind of like a proto-Austrian. People say Adam Smith is the founder of modern economics. Well, not really. I mean, Richard Cantillon's a better bet for that. Now, fast forward a little bit. Franz Brentano was a professor of philosophy at the University of Vienna in the late 1800s, and he personally rejected the doctrine of internal relations. He held contempt for people like Immanuel Kant Hegel. Most importantly, he recognized that thinking is an action. So, again, the big picture here is that Austrian economics realized that you start off by doing economics on a self-evident axiom, which is that humans act, versus, let's say like the logical positivists of the 1920s would argue that every idea that you're going to use in science needs to be falsifiable. So I know I've gone on a little bit. I'm going to fast forward a little bit here. Let me just fast forward to 1912. 1912 was the year that Mises published the book titled The Theory of Money and Credit. And this was a groundbreaking book. He contributed the idea of the regression theorem, which basically shows why money has value. And the reason is money has value because it had value yesterday, etc. The next point is probably one of the most important, and it's that the classical economists, and leading on to the onset of Keynesian economics, they read economists in English. So what does that mean? Well, Mises, he wrote in German. And his work didn't get translated into English till about 1934, or at least the Theory of Money and Credit. But in 1936, Keynes had published the General Theory of Unemployment, Interest, and Money, which basically took over the whole sphere of economics. And nowadays, we have Keynesian economics pretty much just because of that lapse in time. So I guess your question was, what is Austrian economics? Well, Austrians argue that inflation, rather than being an increase in price levels, is quite literally the increase in the money supply. Now, an increase in prices is the effect of inflation because money is worth less if there's more in circulation. But the idea is that money has value because it's scarce. Now, interest rates, that's another important part. And they really confuse people. Interest rates are a reflection of time preferences, meaning it's human nature to want to consume in the present versus the future. So if you consume in the future, you're going to pay a premium for that. It's the same reason why if you put money in the bank, if you take that money out right away, you don't want to accrue any interest, but if you keep it in there, you do. So Mises used the example of a home builder. And imagine you're building a home with bricks. If the interest rate's artificially too low, you might build a house that's way too big or take on a project that goes on too long. And the point is, if the interest rates are eventually manipulated again, you might have to destroy the house. Or if you don't have enough bricks, you can't finish the house and you've lost everything. So I know I've gone on a while and I certainly haven't touched on everything, but the main point out of all of this is that when the government interferes in the market, it screws up everything. And of course, our discussion today is related to war, so we're going to see the effects of this mismanagement.
All right. So we have a, $700 billion screw, that the Congress just voted to put into the U.S. economy. And if you look at actual defense, spending, when you factor in, like the VA and the different departments and intelligence agencies that exist to defend the United States, immigration, and also the interest on the war debt, all that money we spent on the Iraq war that we were supposed to take in Iraqi oil. Well, that war didn't make us any money, and so we're still paying off that debt. So, Steven, I guess, can you just speak broadly about what kind of impacts you think would happen if you just drop $1 trillion on this sector of the economy? The Congress, a couple hundred Americans voted that the other 300 or so million of us are going to spend $1 trillion of our money, of our wealth, on the defense in just 1 year, 2019.
Right. So as many of you may know, the Congress recently passed a $1.2 trillion spending bill, about $700 billion of the budget just for defense. And of course, when they say defense, it usually has nothing really to do with defense, more offense. But let me just quote from one article what the defense bill will cover. Let's see here. The Navy gets 14 new ships, including a carrier. They add 56 F-35s. They get a bunch of helicopters. All the troops are going to get funding for a 2.4% increase in their pay. The Air Force gets $103 million for the wing replacement program on, whatever. So the point is, it's just building up a bunch of ships that you're going to go out and maybe lose in war. You're going to build up a bunch of helicopters that might get destroyed. Point being, that has nothing really to do with defense. And one point I can make is that, this defense bill, it spends more than all of Russia and China combined for their defense spending. Just imagine that. It's just totally insane. That's pretty much the defense bill. So the impact of that is just going to be, we're going to be very deep in debt. Later, this will make much more sense later, that certain industries get propped up during war. It's not all industries, just a few industries, say like steel and gunpowder or whatever. So that's the basic impacts. It's just going to destroy the economy.
Right. And one of the interesting things is just how much of this is actually wasteful. When we talk about the offensive spending, it's easy to see, for any frequent listener of the show that, the 56 or so billion dollars that they allocated to fight the overseas wars are an absolute waste. But as Stephen was naming off some of the programs in the current defense funding bill, he mentioned the purchase of additional F-35s and a new wing program. And I believe that's for the A-10 Warthog, which is the United States close air support airplane. And the idea was that the F-35 was supposed to be a bomber. It was supposed to be a fighter able to dogfight. And it was also supposed to be able to provide this ground air support, this close ground air support. And it turns out the F-35 isn't good at any of these things. And that whenever you have all these troops deployed, especially in these Middle East type counterinsurgency missions, the A-10 Warthog or the close air support is an absolute essential. And since the F-35 isn't meeting its goal of being able to provide that support, they had to, now spend more money on the A-10. However, at the same time, they're still buying additional F-35s. So, when we look at this and, kind of know that in no logical circumstance, Stephen, would anybody continue to pay for F-35s after you're already having to upgrade different airplanes that the F-35 was supposed to replace because the F-35 can't. So, can you talk about a little bit the theory of human action and knowing that since no person and no, private entity would ever spend like this, what happens here?
Yeah, I mean, the most essential point to grasp here is that consumers can't eat a tank. Consumers can't even buy a tank. All the things that are produced from the military industrial complex aren't used by consumers. So it's kind of weird, like, sure, these industries are profiting, but profiting who? Well, the people that get the defense contracts. The next section I have listed here is weapon sales. So I'm going to be referencing this one book. It's called War is a Racket by General Smedley Butler. Now, if you don't know who General Smedley Butler was, try to imagine this. At the time of his death in 1940, he was the most decorated Marine in the entire military. He had like 2 medals of honor, etc. But when he finally retired, he was so upset that he went on a tour throughout the country giving a speech to veterans, and it was called War is a Racket. And thankfully it got made into a book. But one thing you find in wartime is that, as we mentioned before, certain industries do well. So let's talk about war profit. He first points out that when you look at DuPont, the powder people, their average profit from 1910 to 1914 was $6 million a year. Fast forward to the actual World War I years, they averaged $58 million a year. Let's take the Bethlehem Steel Company. They averaged $6 million before the war and $49 million during the war. Or how about United States Steel, another steel company? Their profits went from $105 million to $240 million. So you just see these businesses just rise in multiples in profits. And he just goes on, and some of these examples are hilarious, by the way. So quoting him, they did well by Uncle Sam too, for instance. They sold Uncle Sam 35 million pairs of hobnailed service shoes. There were 4 million soldiers, 8 pairs and more to a soldier. My regiment in the war had only 1 pair per person. Some of these shoes are probably still in existence. But when the war was over, Uncle Sam had 25 million pairs of shoes left over. So they produced 35 million, had 25 million left over. Here's another one. Uncle Sam bought 20 million mosquito nets for the use of soldiers. The only problem? Not a single one of them made it to France. Now, okay, this one's my personal favorite. You're going to love how Patriots sold Uncle Sam 12 dozen 48-inch wrenches. So just to reiterate, 12 dozen 4-foot wrenches. Oh, they were very nice wrenches. The only trouble was that there was only one nut ever made that was large enough for these wrenches. That was the nut that holds the turbine at Niagara Falls. Now, one last thing I'll touch on is he notes just the psychological effects of war, because when we talk about costs of war, only some of the costs are monetary. Many of them are very much psychological. He has this one quote, and I actually gave a presentation in a college class once and read this quote, and I almost shed a tear because really think about this. Quoting him, boys with a normal viewpoint were taken out of the fields and offices and factories and classrooms and put into the ranks. They were remolded. They were made over. They were made to about face, to regard murder as the order of the day. We used them for a couple years and trained them to think nothing at all of being killed or of killing. Then suddenly we discharged them. We didn't need them anymore. So I remember when I gave the quote in my class, I think I walked back to my seat and just kind of shed a tear like, man, these are real people suffering. He talks about how, after the war, he went and visited these veterans. He found that, in the government hospital in Maryland, 1,800 of these boys are in pens. 500 of them are in barracks of steel bars and wire all around the outside of the buildings. These already have been mentally destroyed. So again, when we talk about the cost of war, there are many other costs just besides the monetary costs.
Right. And that's so important. And something I talked about on the show too is the opportunity cost of when you pull all these young men who are, a lot of times the most physically gifted at the very least. And there's a lot of engineers that go into defense, and a lot of nuclear scientists dedicate their lives to making the next bigger nuclear bomb rather than making the new nuclear energy plant that's cleaner, safer, and produces a better amount of energy. And so not only are you taking this, $1 trillion of wealth and time of the Americans have, and not putting it towards other things that could greatly benefit us, and sticking it all into a weapons industry. And, I guess a counterpoint to this that has been brought up to me, and you have to somewhat, give them a little bit, and they say, well, you're going to spend money on security. And that may be true, but, we're talking about, like I said, $1 trillion. So obviously it's way out of proportion.
Oh yeah, totally. It doesn't really make any sense. And another really important point to understand here about Austrian economics is that they recognize, well, let's put it this way, the biggest advocates of war are the biggest opponents of gold. Why? Because the gold standard puts a check on the government. It puts a check on the whole point of gold as a money is that it represents the total stock of gold. So that back in the day when you used to have goldsmiths, used to have people who they didn't want to hoard their gold around. They take it to the goldsmith. The goldsmith would give them a receipt, and they could come redeem that gold anytime they want to. But basically, what happened is that fiat money got introduced essentially to fund the war. I think this first happened during the Civil War when Abraham Lincoln instituted an income tax and started inflating money. That was just the beginning. And fast forward, they started inflating money during every single war. You even hear Milton Friedman talk about this, that, we had problems in past war. We weren't able to inflate the money. We didn't have enough money for the war. Good answer, right? Even Milton Friedman was saying things like that. So yeah, the biggest advocates of war are against the gold standard, and for a really solid reason if you think about it. It's because they couldn't finance the wars otherwise. I think that's one of the most important points in all of this.
Yeah, that is a very interesting point. And just one last thing I want to circle back to that I think was something really profound that you said at the beginning, pointing out how the profit margins of all these companies went way up during war times. And you mentioned like DuPont. Well, the other thing that I'm sure happens is that these companies then see their profits tied to the war. And what do companies do? They lobby Congress for things that make them more money. And so it seems like you kind of just enter into this feedback loop where the weapons makers and all these other companies that benefit off the wars have more money because of the war going on. And so then they're able to pay, more lobbyists and, more campaign donations and however else they do their corruption in Washington, D.C. these days. And, if nothing else, they buy influence and, they buy the influence of having the ear of the congressman. And so they could say, Mr. Congressman, Iran is very, very dangerous. And, you really have to do something about this. And, it's not necessarily that they just tell the congressman murder for money. But they get the congressman's ear and then they say things like, oh man, Iran is really cheating on that nuclear agreement. Oh, that Vladimir Putin, he's a real nasty guy. You can't trust the North Korean. And then this is how they, buy the influence this way. And so it just seems to me like it's going to be a really hard thing to ever break that kind of feedback loop type agreement. But, as the Austrian theory recognizes that this is human action, that people are going to do what makes them the most wealth the easiest. And so if you offer this giant Pentagon honeypot, if you say, hey, we're going to give out $1 trillion and well, the stories we know about the Pentagon's accounting, we know that it's very poor. There's easy money to be made here. And so why wouldn't people, look to exploit that?
Right. And I like to relate it back to real life. Like just, I mentioned a minute ago, Butler talked about, 20 million mosquito nets that never got used. Well, what if, or he talks about like, 35 million pairs of shoes were made and only 25 million were used. Well, imagine if a Payless Shoes operated like that. Imagine they ordered like 1 million pairs of shoes and they only sell 5 pairs of shoes a week. And a year from now, it's like, oh man, we haven't made enough money. So the government acts in directly the opposite way of how people in the market would operate. People operate in the market on incentives. You got to save money. You got to keep track of your finances. Government acts in the direct opposite way of that.
Right. And so now I kind of want to get into one specific industry because I see story after story coming out. And if you kind of look at how these companies are behaving on Twitter, obviously the big news would be Alex Jones being removed from certain sites, not Twitter, of course, but then Peter Van Buren, former State Department official and whistleblower, author of We Meant Well and Hooper's War, Scott Horton, author of Fool's Errand, editor at antiwar.com, and Dan McAdams, the director of the Ron Paul Institute, were all removed from Twitter for pretty big tweet. It was somewhat inappropriate, but it wasn't that bad. And so We see things like this going on, Steven, more censorship. We see these companies getting big contracts. I've talked about Amazon, getting cloud service contracts from the Pentagon, and Google, developing AI for Pentagon drones. That's Project Maven. And we know these other companies are starting to tie, and have money in the government. And so what do you think we could see happen as these industries find that, the best place for them to make easy profit isn't by pleasing the consumers, but by getting the government to rob their consumers for them?
I mean, that's a really, really good question. I have to think about that a little more. You made a good point earlier about how industries that may otherwise not have been involved with wartime, if they can find a way to get involved and get some contracts. Again, when we talk about 20 million mosquito nets, maybe the company got contracted for mosquito nets, but otherwise, they're just making mosquito nets for people living in the deep south or whatever. So it's totally hard to say how the structure of production just gets totally screwed up when you have resources diverted, into many different areas. And the last section I was going to talk about is like the economics of war. And I'm going to discuss a book that was written, I think it was in 1970 by a guy named Seymour Melman. Now, Seymour Melman, he was very much on the left. He was definitely not a libertarian. He wrote a book called Pentagon Capitalism. So, if you're ready, I can just, this next session is just going to be like 10 to 15 solid facts. So whenever you're ready.
Yeah, go for it, Steven. I'd love to hear it.
All right, let's do it. So, yeah, like I said, I was going to source about like 3 other books, but I'm like, man, this is seeming like a 2-hour episode. So Seymour Melman wrote a book called Pentagon Capitalism. And basically what he talks about are the costs of war, essentially. So he says this: from 1946 to 1969, the government spent over $1 trillion in the military, and more than half of this was under the Kennedy and Johnson administration. He points out that the 1970 fiscal budget plan of the Department of Defense was $83 billion. This exceeds the gross national product. And by the way, they used GNP versus GDP back then. This exceeded the GNP of entire nations. And of course, you think back to nowadays, of course, our military spending covers like a combination of all of the countries in their defense spending. Now, here's a really crazy point. Imagine all the fuel you use in a single year as a motorist for your car or whatever. The amount of fuel that would allow an F-16 training jet to fly, that amount of fuel would last that jet under an hour. Here's another crazy one. The good old Abrams tank. Now, you know how cars get, miles per gallon, so maybe like 25 miles per gallon. Well, the Abrams tank is gallons per mile. The Abrams tank gets 3.8 gallons per mile. Really think about that. Now, chapter 8 of Pentagon Capitalism, this is like the main chapter I'm going to be sourcing right now. It's titled The Cost of the Parastates of the American Society, and he points out facts such as these. He starts by pointing out that since the end of World War II, we've spent $1 trillion on military purposes. What was the opportunity cost? Well, this is equal to the value of all residential and business structures in the entire U.S. He has one section where he talks about what could be financed each month if we weren't in Vietnam. So each month of the war in Vietnam, we could have financed the complete training of 100,000 scientists. We could have financed an annual food bill to end hunger among 10 million Americans. And again, he does come from the left, so he'll say things like, if we got rid of military spending, we could apply it to welfare. He's not wrong. It could be used for welfare, but if coming from the left, he would argue things like that.
Right. And, I think that's kind of an important kind of thing. It's just to mention that, hey, these are things that I could go to. Not that me and Steven are necessarily advocating that, I want to have a program that trains a whole bunch of scientists. Right. But if you ask me, do you want to build an F-35 or do you want to, build better roads or train a bunch of scientists? Well, even from a libertarian standpoint, one is clearly better than the other.
Oh, absolutely. Now, I think this next point is really the knockout point. If you think about all the stuff we've been talking about, just the siphoning of resources, think about this. In November 1967, the Organization for Economics, Cooperation, and Development found that the U.S. had 700,000 scientists, engineers, and technicians working in research and development. However, 63% of this activity was on behalf of the military. So in essence, the military siphons off about 2/3 of technological researchers into their sectors. And also, if you want to learn a little bit more about that, Murray Rothbard has a little book called Science, Technology, and Government, and he points out that government couldn't operate if it didn't siphon off as many good people from the private enterprise as it did. Government is always trying to get good people from the private enterprise. And that's why Rothbard's joke is we don't want good, lousy, can't show up on time people in the government, have all the good people in the private sector. So those are kind of the points I just want to touch on. I pretty much went over all the facts I wanted to, but I think the viewers just kind of have a sense for, wow, there's really a big cost to any type of war, to any type of war. And again, Pentagon capitalism was written in 1970, and he's talking about defense budgets of like 80 billion. We're talking about like 700 billion nowadays. I mean, can you imagine? I think one point he makes is, can you imagine a billion of something? Can anybody imagine a billion of something? I mean, we hear about like $20 billion being spent on a missile, but the average person, my business teacher told me this many years ago, a single person, it'd be almost impossible for a single person to spend $1 billion. Unless, of course, you buy like just nonstop Ferraris, but in general, to just, live within your means, you can never spend $1 billion. It's hard to imagine that much money. This is an astronomical amount of resources being used and siphoned off that could have been used to feed somebody. I mean, I'm a libertarian, but I would rather see someone being fed versus someone being blown up in a country 2,000 miles away.
Right. And, each of these bombs cost tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars. I mean, who knows how many airstrikes the United States has carried out in the past, 17 years of the terror war, where the target, whatever they hit and blew up, say it's an empty building somewhere, the bomb itself costs a hell of a lot more than the building did. And, occasionally maybe one of those bombs does catch a, terrorist kind of guy who is, a real terrible ISIS guy that, cuts off people's heads and absolutely deserves to die. However, is that guy, is that the most efficient way to kill him, by blowing him up? And that also means that you're going to drop 9 other missiles, and those missiles are also going to cost $100,000 or whatever each. And, 7 of those, may hit, innocent people. So you end up killing all these innocent people for every one bad person you kill. And it costs you $1 million to carry out all those strikes too. So, what's worth it? And also with that first one you made, this is one of the things that, when I was, really discovering the libertarian movement that really turned me off from the left, was the fact that, like, I knew that the F-35 or, the F-16 and the Abrams tank just eat fuel. And imagine how much fuel it takes to, like, operate all these different missions, aircraft, naval, different vessels and stuff like that.
Oh, it almost seems like they need the oil just to fund their military operations. It's not even about getting the oil so America can be oil dependent or independent or whatever. It just doesn't even make any sense. Another point we can mention is if any of the viewers right now are in school, you're going to hear this myth at some point. It's the myth that World War II brought us out of the Great Depression. Now, this is total nonsense myth. Obviously, if you understand the history, the Great Depression was from 1929 to 1939. World War II ended in 1946, if I'm not mistaken. 1945, 1946, something like that. So, obviously it didn't bring us out of the Great Depression. The Great Depression was, very much, extended because of FDR's policies with the New Deal. He made everything worse. But the main idea of Keynesian economics is that destruction can bring about wealth. It's just the basic broken window fallacy that if I go break my neighbor's window, it's going to create a job. They're going to call a window glazier. But the point obviously is that $100 that they're going to use to spend for a new window, it would have been used in a probably more efficient area of the economy. Probably it's maybe create a job. Maybe they're going to hire another employee, and now they can't because they have to fix the window. So there's cost to everything. And if you're only looking at the end results, which is basically what Keynesians do, then you're going to disregard the means. Even if the means is, my God, blowing up children. What have we become?
Right. The kind where I was going with that before was just that it always seems so odd to me that there's all these, quote unquote liberals who are, Hillary Clinton-ite neoliberals, who, I now know don't really have any principles, but, they're driving around in Priuses talking about how they're saving the environment, but never once do any of them say, well, forget about Priuses. Let's just cancel like 10 F-16 shorties, right?
Oh,
yeah, go for it.
Did you see my post on my timeline the other day? I was at King Soopers and I saw this one SUV. It was a Subaru SUV, and one of the bumper stickers said, "If you're against socialism, then you can get off my public road." That's exactly how it's worded. If you're against socialism, then you should get off my public road. So, I mean, yeah, I waited till she came out because I was curious, like, who is this person? It was an old white lady, of course. She had a ton of other ridiculous bumper stickers, but, yeah, she's driving a really nice car and complaining about, oh, we need socialism to fund the roads. And the roads in Denver are horrible, by the way. Like, even in the parking lot for the King Soopers, there's like a big pothole. You drive right onto the road, there's big potholes. It's kind of funny, and it's comically devastating. I don't even know. It's crazy. Oh,
Right.
let me-
Our
let me-
roads around here are terrible too. And
Oh, yeah.
I'm outside of Boston, so the income tax is ridiculous. And I'm thinking about calling Domino's to fix my road. So
Yeah, man. I have one point written down here that I've started that I just want to mention.
right.
If you really want to get an idea of how the government spends for defense contracts in Pentagon capitalism, I think for me it's like page like 177. It's about like 2 or 3 pages, and maybe I can try to send you like a picture of this so you can post it later. But it's just pages and pages of all the different types of defense contracts. Whether it's missile contracts or fighter jet contracts or Navy ship contracts, and you'll see like 3 years invested in like one project and like billions and billions and billions of dollars. And you can assume that a lot of the projects were left for dead. They never went through with them all. We're just talking about what actually was attempted to be produced. I'll try to send that to you later so the viewers can have an idea of just how crazy it is, because it's hard to have any idea of how crazy it is unless you actually look at this stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
And I'll make sure to link to all these books in the show notes page. I'm sure I'm going to be purchasing a couple of them that you talked about, in today's episode. And I really appreciate it. And, the show notes page will be at, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com or on the libertarianinstitute.org. Stephen, go ahead, wrap up with anything you want, and then, tell people where to find you, what you're doing these days.
Oh, it's been a pleasure coming on, Kyle. I hope this episode's a good resource episode for people. Like if you just need to compile a few facts to crush your enemies, this will be a good episode for that. Hopefully, even if viewers that are listening are on the left and you've never heard of Austrian economics before, give it a chance, do the research, and then make up your mind. But definitely research the stuff first. I think you'll find that, especially on foreign policy, the left and the right, or left and the libertarians can very much build a bridge. We're very much in agreement with a lot of things that happens. So I'd say that, and I'd say, if you want to find more about me, you can find me at forpeaceandliberty.com. If you want to just reach out to me and talk to me on Facebook, I'm Steven Clyde on Facebook. I love talking to libertarian nerds. I'm always posting stuff about my nerdiness, so love to talk to you. Other than that, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me on, Kyle, and I'd love to do it again.
Right. And just real quick, I'd like to plug, the Libertarian Union, which me and Steven Clyde are both a part of. And, we do episodes all together, and we all have our own individual podcasts, Foreign Policy Focus, Peace and Liberty, Liberty Weekly, just to name a few of the podcasts that are out there. So check out Libertarian Union. And then if you really like my show, think about donating patreon.com/foreign policy focus. Thanks again for coming on.
Thanks again.